Every year, violent collisions kill 3,000 Canadians and injure another 200,000. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
This truck's a mess. It's rolled over, it's been hit once, probably twice on the side. Can you imagine what it was like inside this truck for the occupants? Well, somebody has to, and that person's studying occupant kinematics. Now, occupant kinematics is all about how people move inside a car. We can use it to analyze seatbelt issues, airbag issues. Now, sometimes it can come into play in more mysterious cases, where even the very nature of the crash is a question.
It's after midnight on an empty stretch of road when a woman notices a man frantically trying to flag her down. She is a little reluctant to stop, but as she draws closer, she can hear the man pleading for help. The man tells her that his car has gone off the side of the road into the river, with his elderly mother still inside. Within minutes, a local trooper arrives on the scene.
It's down there, down there. Where?
But by the time they get back down to the car, the body is nowhere to be found.
He said that he'd spent some 15 or 20 minutes swimming up and down, searching for his mother, trying to get her out of the car.
Please, somebody, as soon as possible.
The man identifies himself as Anthony Salter. At the time of the accident, his elderly mother had recently undergone hip replacement surgery, and Anthony decided to move back into her house to take care of her. When he tells the police about his failed attempt to save his mother, the officer is impressed by his calm behavior and ability to recall all of the details of the incident. At the hospital, a routine checkup shows that Anthony hasn't suffered a single injury from the crash. The doctor is surprised by these findings, and the escorting officer decides to take photos of the examination. The next day, Anthony receives terrible news from the police. Earlier that morning, his mother's body was found washed up on the riverbank. On first blush, Marion Salter's death appears to be a tragic accident. But 2 weeks after the crash, District Attorney Rick Esser receives information that puts a doubt in his mind.
The first phone call that was of great benefit to the investigation was one from an insurance agent.
The agent explains to the DA that Anthony had recently increased his mother's life insurance policy and that he seemed desperate to get his hands on the money. From that moment, Rick decides to completely re-examine the dynamics of the crash.
While we had our doubts about the defendant's story, we wanted to see if the laws of physics demonstrated that is this person a valid suspect or is this likely an accident? That's why we had Joe Hancock get involved.
Crash reconstructionist Joe Hancock usually works in another jurisdiction, but he is quickly identified as the best man for the job.
They wouldn't waste my time, and I wouldn't waste their time. For them to call me at the scene, I knew it had to be a complex case and that it would take a great deal of investigation.
Joe is a specialist among specialists. His field of expertise studies the body's movement inside a vehicle during a crash, a science called occupant kinematics.
In the information that I received from Mr. Esser was that Anthony had advised the investigators that he was driving his mother home from a bridge game. She had just recently had a hip operation and she was under medication. But as they were traveling down the road, he was traveling approximately about 70 miles per hour when he must have fallen asleep. And when he fell asleep, he drifted off the road and he did not wake up until his vehicle was just entering the water.
When Joe begins his reconstruction, 2 weeks have already passed since the accident. Thankfully, local authorities have done a thorough job documenting the scene. To determine whether or not the crash was really an accident, Joe has to analyze the three most important factors in occupant kinematics: the crash scene, the vehicle, and the occupant's injuries.
One of the things that Mr. Esser did was show me photographs taken very recently after the crash of Mr. Salter. And immediately I saw that this person had no marks at all on his chest or upper body.
Joe suspects that this photograph might be a highly valuable source of information, but he can't make any assumptions without first looking at the other elements of the crash.
I needed to see the scene.
Hello.
Joe heads over to the crash site with the investigator who first mapped the scene. Detective Eddie Verdon shows Joe where Salter claims his car went airborne and jumped into the water at around 110 kilometers per hour.
Looking at the tire tracks and looking at the scene, my experience told me already that this did not happen the way Anthony had described. First of all, if a vehicle did go off a cliff at 70 miles per hour, the vehicle would have almost cleared the river completely and landed on the other side.
But Detective Verdon informs Joe that the vehicle was found in the water only 5 meters from the shoreline. Both men agree on one thing. The car had to be traveling at a much slower speed than Salter claimed.
Now, of course, that does not mean that he is lying. He has been involved in a traumatic crash. He has lost his mother. He could have a hard time remembering correctly. My job is to not really dwell too much of what Anthony said, but what does the physical evidence tell me?
Joe's next stop is the embankment. At the base of the cliff, he can easily see where the vehicle left the cliff and came down. Then, on the edge of the shoreline, hidden between the rocks, Joe makes an amazing discovery.
I noticed that there was debris from a vehicle still in the rocks. And I then identified a headlamp assembly, some molding from the luggage rack, and an antenna from a motor vehicle.
This unexpected find sheds a whole new light on Joe's investigation.
Seeing that, I knew that this vehicle did not actually hit water first, but it hit the base of the cliff first. This area at the base of the cliff was roughly about 7 to 8 feet from the base of the cliff, so the vehicle went off at a very low speed.
This clearly disproves Anthony's recollection of the speed he was traveling, but it still does not contradict his basic version of events. It's entirely possible that the car simply slowed before plunging off the cliff.
We were able to determine that the vehicle left the cliff roughly about 19 miles per hour and hit the bottom of the cliff at 22 miles per hour.
Meanwhile, at the DA's office, Rick Esser receives a phone call from a woman introducing herself as Marion Salter's former private nurse. Mary Ross says she decided to call the DA after she learned about Marion's death in the newspaper. She informs Rick that Anthony had let her go a few months earlier, saying that he couldn't afford her services anymore.
Good afternoon.
According to Ross, Anthony kept complaining that the costs related to his mother's condition were forcing him to postpone his own retirement. A woman suffers a horrible death when the car she and her son are traveling in drives off the road into a river. Clues at the crash site and interviews with family members have led investigators to suspect her son's version of events. But so far, there is little concrete evidence that would suggest any wrongdoing.
Even if he's lying, does not mean there's anything else about this crash. But I need to do a complete reconstruction.
Then, the autopsy reports come in with shocking findings. While confirming that the victim died from drowning, it also shows that there were abnormally high levels of sedatives in her blood.
Well, when I saw the amount of medication in her system, I then understood that she was basically passed out. She was quite asleep and anything could have happened.
This information is a major break in the investigation. While Anthony's mother was taking pain medication for her injured hip, the levels were far beyond the prescribed amount, suggesting that someone may have tampered with her dosage in order to render her unconscious. But despite mounting evidence of foul play, the only thing that can prove it one way or the other are the kinematics of the crash itself. The next step is to analyze the damage to the vehicle.
As I approached the front of the car, I did notice that there was severe front-end damage. It's starting to confirm for me that the vehicle hit nose first.
On the right front of the car, one headlight assembly is missing. while the one on the left-hand side identically matches the model Joe found on the embankment.
I then noticed that the antenna fit into the receptacle for the antenna. And I also noticed that the weather stripping for the roof rack did match up to the crashed vehicle.
Joe next turns his attention to the numerous scratches and bumps found on the car. For this veteran accident investigator, reading those marks is like reading a book. And soon Joe was able to precisely reconstruct the dynamics of the crash.
Well, I also noticed in my observations of the car, scrape marks that were in a circular pattern. So it does confirm to me that the vehicle hit nose first, pivoted on the nose, and fell on the driver's side of the car. And then the scrape marks all along the side, the driver's side, well, that tells me that the vehicle then slid into the water.
At this point, Joe knows how the crash occurred. But in order to reconstruct the truth, he will need to determine exactly how this squares with the injuries to the occupants. And this is where Marion Salter's autopsy report might be the key.
I saw that Marion had bruising on both her left and right knees. She had bruises along the shin of her right leg. I then can match those up to contact points in the car. Here and here.
On the passenger side of the car, the history of Marion Salter's final moments is clearly written.
So it looks like her knees came in and hit the dash here. That the ashtray is broken.
All the marks that Joe finds on the passenger side are consistent with Marion's exact injuries. They also indicate that the victim was not wearing a seatbelt. But Joe suspects that the final clue may lay on the driver's side. Since he saw that photograph of Anthony's unharmed chest, Joe has been mystified as to how he could survive an accident of this magnitude virtually unscathed. This is the crux of the entire investigation. If he can prove that Salter was not in the vehicle at the time of the crash, it will be enough to bring charges against him.
If he's not belted in the car, this is what should have happened. He should have hit the steering wheel like a person falling off a two-story building. You would have seen contact points of his body against the steering wheel in the column. We did not see that.
The absence of marks shows that Anthony Salter was certainly not driving this car unbelted when it went over the cliff. But Joe still has to rule out one last possibility that could be raised in Salter's defense. What if Anthony was actually wearing his seatbelt?
So in this case, we don't have any marking from a body on the dash or the steering wheel. Now, in a lower speed crash with the seatbelts, that's what seatbelts are for, and so it should be preventing that kind of contact. But that's going to leave some sort of marks on the body where the belts come across your ribs and across your waist. What we're going to do is an experiment here with the belts and the dummy. We're going to go ahead and take this belt, and we're going to put chalk on it to show where it would mark what's called the D-ring here. And we're going to also have the belt across the dummy and see how he loads that belt in the crash. Let's see how my buddy the dummy did. Okay, so let's see how my buddy the dummy made out. We're gonna look at the belts, and you can see where the belt actually made contact. You'll see it in the footage. There's a mark on the chest and on the stomach here. And then at the point, and this is exactly right, at the point where the belt went through the D-ring, you can see where it scraped away some of the chalk, and there's actually a little blur, a little smear mark there. That's from the body loading a belt. That's what we expect to see when we have a driver.
In Anthony Salter's car, the driver's seatbelt is still in perfect condition. And with this photo that was taken on the night of the crash, Joe was able to prove that Anthony didn't sustain any bruising.
If he was belted in the car, he should have had these bruises across his shoulder. That did not occur.
We had such a mountain of evidence against him, we decided to place him under arrest. We had no doubt that he was going to be convicted.
During Anthony Salter's trial, Joe Hancock reconstructs his version of the crash for the jury. He leads them step by step through the sordid details of Anthony's intricate plan to murder his mother.
A staged criminal act had taken place.
Late one night, Anthony Salter is driving his 81-year-old mother home from her weekly game of bridge. He most likely offers her a drink that he's heavily spiked with sedative, and within minutes she is asleep. Anthony is familiar with the road and knows the exact moment to pull off where the ground begins to slope toward the small river. He stops just long enough to get out of the car, leaves it in gear, and then watches as the vehicle begins to roll. The car falls over the cliff and hits the embankment, twisting and toppling into the water. As the car slowly sinks out of view with his mother trapped inside, Anthony scrambles down the embankment and splashes muddy water on himself. A few minutes later, he is flagging down a passing motorist for help.
Joe's accident reconstruction was the pièce de résistance, if you want to call it. It's hard to refute the laws of physics.
The jury is quickly convinced, and Anthony Salter is sentenced to life in prison for the premeditated murder of his mother.
In car crashes, body movements occur in a split second, literally in the blink of an eye. Did you see where the dummy was in this crash? Did you see how close it got to the steering wheel when the airbag deployed? In a crash test like that, high-speed cameras can document a sequence happening too fast for the human eye. But in the field, there's no high-speed cameras. It's up to the accident investigator to use good observations and make the right deductions, particularly in occupant ejection cases where you're trying to figure out who might have been driving.
It's early on an ordinary Monday morning, and two kids are taking a shortcut on their way to school. But as they move through a densely weeded area, they spot something in the brush that turns out to be anything but ordinary. Minutes later, police secure the scene of a fatal car accident. A vehicle is flipped on its side in a ravine with one man pinned down underneath. Leading this investigation is crash reconstructionist Tom Stoley.
My main role is to gather facts, information, evidence to determine all of the elements surrounding this particular crash. We had a victim that was underneath the car. Was there anybody else in the car? Were they the sole occupant of the car? Who was driving?
As officers search the area for other ejected occupants, Tom notices the overgrown weeds and realizes that the car is barely visible from the roadway.
The first thing that struck my mind was, how long had this been there? It could have been hours, it could have been days.
A paramedic confirms that the man is dead and has been probably for a few hours. But taking the corpse away at this stage could potentially disturb crucial evidence.
I decided to keep the body in place until we had a chance to really go over the scene and gather everything we could.
There are several items strewn around the site. A couple of empty beer bottles and unopened packs of cigarettes litter the area. Further up the ravine, a baseball cap has also been thrown from the car. Inside the vehicle, the contents of a wallet are spread out, and police quickly find a license that reveals the identity of the victim. The name Alex Trevino is well known to the police. He lives with his uncle, Gene Mitchell, and their home is regularly visited by officers answering calls related to public disturbances and drunken brawling. Alex and Gene are rarely seen without each other, and around town everyone knows who they are. The car is licensed to Gene, but a quick check shows that Alex is registered as a second driver. As police try to contact Gene Mitchell, Tom directs his attention to the physical evidence on the roadway. Analyzing a pair of tread marks left on the asphalt, he is able to visualize the events leading up to the crash.
As it enters the curve, it goes into a side skid. It's rotating. It's where the rear tire crosses over the path of the front tire. That's why they get wider here.
Such traces of rotating motion lead Tom to one conclusion. The car entered the curve traveling way too fast.
Every curve, every bend in the roadway has what's called a critical curve speed. Now that's a speed that you can't go faster than and still stay on the curve. Now if we know the radius of the turn and something about how sticky the road is, friction, we can actually calculate that speed. So what we want to do is stay inside of that speed. Now we're going to do an experiment here. I'm going to drive through this curve to show how fast we can go and still stay on the curve. So there it is. It doesn't take more than about 5 miles an hour over that critical curve speed, and you're out of control. Those yellow signs, they're there for a reason. Someone's already done the calculation for you. Follow the direction.
Obviously, the driver who caused these tire marks wasn't following directions at all.
I was able to determine the speed of the vehicle, and it was in the neighborhood of 61, 62 miles per hour. More than 30 miles per hour the speed limit.
It's also clear that in order to shear off a utility pole like that, there had to have been a massive impact. As an accident investigator, Tom's role is to make sure that every aspect of the crash matches up with his observations. The car's left front and back wheel rims are broken, probably due to it sliding sideways. And the damage at the rear end of the vehicle is consistent with slamming into the utility pole. But as Tom finally authorizes the removal of the victim's body from the scene, he is surprised to see that Alex's body shows no sign of injury.
It was fairly undamaged for this type of collision.
Tom then receives confirmation that no other victims, dead or alive, have been found in the surrounding area. Naturally, this would suggest that Alex was traveling alone and that he was the one driving the vehicle. But Tom has his doubts.
Well, one of the first things that drew my attention was the victim was clutching a pack of cigarettes in his hand, and the driver was trying to steer through the curve, trying to steer back onto the roadway. How do you do that with a pack of cigarettes in your hand?
Tom has a growing suspicion that someone else was driving the vehicle. He requests an immediate check on the crash victims recently admitted to nearby hospitals and starts looking for clues that may suggest there was a second occupant in the car. Studying the new pack of cigarettes more closely, Tom wonders if it may have been purchased just moments before the crash.
It appeared to be a fresh pack of cigarettes, like he was in the process of opening them at the time.
Following his instincts, Tom decides to check out a convenience store located just half a mile from the scene, on the exact same road the car was coming from.
That would seem like a logical spot that they may have stopped to purchase these cigarettes.
In an amazing twist, the store clerk tells Tom that Alex Trevino had indeed been in the store earlier to buy cigarettes. And he was not alone. Screening the surveillance camera footage, Tom is able to locate an image showing that Alex Trevino walked into the store with another man. The clerk knows them both well. He identifies Alex's companion as his uncle and buddy, Gene Mitchell.
It was a great piece of evidence because it puts them together just before the crash. And the other important piece of information in the video was Gene Mitchell's wearing a baseball cap.
A baseball cap identical to the one Tom found on the crash scene.
It places Gene Mitchell at the scene and also helps pinpoint the time of the crash.
With this new piece of evidence, Tom knows that a few minutes after 4:42 that morning, Gene Mitchell was riding with his nephew, Alex Trevino, when their vehicle violently left the road due to excessive speed. His next task will be to determine who was driving. And since alcohol seems to be involved, the answer to that question could lead to serious consequences for the surviving victim. Investigator Tom Stoley has just discovered that an accident victim found dead on the roadside earlier that morning was actually traveling with his uncle just moments before the crash. But the uncle is nowhere to be found. On his way back to the police station, Tom receives a call from dispatch. He learns that Gene Mitchell has been admitted to a hospital just a few miles from the crash site and is being treated for multiple injuries, including what police call road rash. Tom requests that a blood sample be taken from the suspect and rushes to the hospital.
I want to get the blood as soon as possible.
Road rash is a term that we use in medicine to describe an abrasion. Oftentimes when someone falls on asphalt, they fall off a bicycle, they get ejected from a motor vehicle accident, you will see the skin abraded. Road rash is something that we see very, very frequently.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Investigator Stoley. I'm here to meet with one of my colleagues.
Oh, yeah, just right there.
At the ER entrance desk, Tom meets with a patrolling officer who tells him that he'd found the suspect about an hour before.
Hey, stop!
Mitchell had been shirtless and obviously intoxicated, yelling and wandering in the middle of the street. When the responding officer went to talk to him, He quickly noticed severe abrasions across the left side of Mitchell's head, leg, arm, and chest.
He claimed that he had been the victim of an assault. He had been beaten up by one or two other people.
Mitchell's wounds did not appear consistent with this type of assault. There were no bruises or similar injuries you'd expect to result from an attack. But the injuries were serious enough for the officer to take Mitchell to the hospital. Next, Tom interviews the ER physician handling Gene Mitchell's case. Dr. Bill Marciano tells him that both of his patient's clavicles are fractured. Mitchell also has 6 broken ribs, a punctured spleen, a collapsed and contused left lung, and many cuts and scrapes.
They were substantial injuries. Most of them were localized to the left side of his body. They were clearly not injuries from an assault. They were definitely from some car crash.
Injury analysis is a key element in accident reconstruction. And as the doctor enumerates Mitchell's injuries, Tom continues the reconstruction of the crash in the same way as you would build a brick wall, piece by piece.
The way the vehicle left the roadway, one of the first things it did was impacted a utility pole near the left rear of the car. And it would be reasonable that the person sitting in the driver's seat would be slammed against the left side of the car and sustain some fairly major injuries on their left side. That would account for the broken ribs on the left side, the ruptured spleen, and the various other internal type injuries he received. Yeah, certainly.
Gene Mitchell's blood test results confirm that he was highly intoxicated on his arrival at the hospital. If Tom is able to prove that he was behind the wheel at the time of the crash, Mitchell will certainly be facing some serious criminal charges. Dr. Marciano understands the situation and he authorizes Tom to interrogate his patient.
When I spoke to Gene, he gave a couple of conflicting versions of the cause of his injuries and his whereabouts that night. Finally, he did admit that he was with Alex Trevino and that he was in the vehicle. However, he wouldn't say that he was driving. He stated that Alex was driving.
All the physical evidence so far suggests that Mitchell may be lying. But Tom knows that if the case goes to court, he will need all aspects of the crash scene to match up with his reconstruction. And one mystery remains. Why would Alex Trevino's body suffer so little damage in the accident? Back at the scene, Tom starts looking for physical evidence that may help him put that last brick in the wall.
The driver's side window is broken. All the other window glass is intact. The passenger would have had to been ejected out the driver's side window, as well as the driver.
This single observation solves the mystery of Alex's undamaged body and allows Tom to finalize his reconstruction of the events that led to Alex Trevino's untimely death. In the middle of the night, Gene Mitchell is driving back home from a bar with his nephew Alex Trevino. Severely intoxicated, Gene's reflexes are highly affected, and his car enters a curve at more than 50 kilometers per hour faster than the curve's critical speed limit. Unable to complete the turn, the vehicle skids to the left side of the road and hits a utility pole before it starts overturning in grassy terrain. Gene Mitchell is crushed up against the left side of the car, and his body absorbs all the violent impact. In the process, he acts as a virtual shield protecting Alex Trevino from any bodily harm. After the first roll, Mitchell's body is propelled through the driver's side window and lands violently on the ground. But by the time Alex passes through the already broken window, the car has lost some of its momentum, and he lands softly on the long weeds. Unfortunately, a moment later, the car rolls on top of him, squeezing his body into the spongy turf.
The cause of death was positional asphyxia.
Positional asphyxia occurs when the patient can't get oxygen into his lungs. Sometimes that is due to a heavy object on the chest, so the lungs can't expand.
The autopsy later reveals that Alex Trevino suffered only 2 broken ribs and would have easily survived the crash if the vehicle had not rolled on top of him. Gene Mitchell pleads guilty to criminal vehicular operation, resulting in the death of Alex Trevino. He was sentenced to 4 years confinement plus 5 years probation.
The human condition often plays a role in crashes. For younger drivers, we perceive them to be reckless, inexperienced, driving too fast. It's a fact of life for those of us aging. We know our eyesight isn't what it used to be, and our reaction time has slowed down a little bit. Now, any one of these factors can play a role in a crash. Today, it's Frank Carson's job to figure out if one did.
On a hot, muggy afternoon, Jane Balfour is busy working in her garden when the sudden sound of metal hitting metal jars her out of her thoughts. She looks up just in time to see a vehicle sideswipe the neighbor's car and continue on down the street towards a parking lot. Jane rushes back into the house and calls 911. When she comes back out, she sees that the car has actually come to a stop, but not before having hit a pedestrian. A passing jogger stops to help the injured woman while Jane checks on the driver of the car.
Okay, my name is Jane.
He's an older man, and while he doesn't seem to have any external injuries, he's only semi-conscious and his breathing is slow. Medics arrive on the scene within minutes and rush both individuals to the hospital. Frank Carson, traffic reconstructionist, is called in to head up the investigation.
After the officer briefed me, I started looking around, and the only thing I could see was the driver's car hit a parked car. They were still stuck together. Garbage can had been knocked over, and of course the area where the pedestrian had fallen down after she had gotten hit. And that's all I had to go on at that point.
Frank's job is a difficult one. He will need to determine exactly why this car left the road and hit the passing pedestrian. His findings could have serious ramifications for the driver, victim, and their families. As a first step, he runs a check on the car's registration, and the owner is identified as Mr. Harold Carlisle, a 68-year-old local man.
He's over there.
Frank then turns his attention to the crash site.
I went back down the road from the direction that it looked like his car came to look for other marks on the roadway.
But there is no roadway evidence of skidding or any other signs of braking.
What I found astonishing about this crash is the car had traveled such a long distance without any input from the driver.
Frank measures over 170 meters of the driverless tire marks.
The car went a long distance, so he had to have been traveling at a pretty decent speed. It's a 25-mile-an-hour zone, and we were able to calculate from the marks on the roadway and other evidence that he was probably going at least 50 miles an hour at the beginning of this whole scenario to be able to travel that far, hit the curbs, hit the pedestrian, and still have enough energy to hit a parked car.
Frank's at a loss. He can't begin to explain the bizarre crash. There's just no evidence to give him a clue as to what might have happened here.
So in a crash like this, you start thinking about different scenarios, how the crash could have occurred, what may have caused it. Was there a mechanical problem with the car? And the other possibility is he may have done what some people do and confuse the brake pedal with the gas pedal.
Accident investigators find themselves working on cases where the driver has mistaken the brake and the accelerator pedal. It may seem surprising, but it happens, and it can lead to disastrous results. Can you imagine being on the freeway and a big truck in front of you slowing, and instead of going for the brake, you go for the accelerator? That's not a good thing. Now, a lot of times when this happens is you find a certain type of tire mark, an acceleration scuff, and accident investigators are trained to identify that. It's different than a braking tire mark. But here, Frank doesn't have either. So what's he going to do? How's he going to solve this case?
The vehicle also shows no damage that would suggest Carlisle had been run off the road or involved in an earlier collision. Next, Frank requests that the car be taken back to the garage for a full forensic inspection.
So the scene information and what the witnesses told me didn't help a lot to answer some of the questions we had. We have a car that's out of control, and we have a pedestrian. And did the pedestrian maybe accidentally step in front of the car? That's something we don't know about right now. And the best way to find that out is going to be to go to the hospital and talk to Mr. Carlisle, see what he might remember.
The case is starting to rely heavily on Stephanie Platt and Harold Carlisle. Mr. Harold Carlisle, a 68-year-old man, is involved in a dramatic accident when he loses control of his vehicle and hits Stephanie Platt. Both Mrs. Platt and Mr. Carlisle are rushed to the emergency room. Accident reconstructionist Frank Carson is heading up the investigation. Testimonies and physical evidence show Mr. Carlisle's car left the road, but it appears that he never tried to regain control before slamming into Mrs. Platt.
So while I'm driving the hospital, I have a couple scenarios to run through my head. What happened to Mr. Carlisle to make him do this? Was he maybe impaired by drugs or alcohol? Did he have kind of medical crisis? Or maybe he passed out?
Or could a mechanical failure have caused the crash? Frank hopes to speak with Harold and Stephanie, the only two people who know exactly what happened. But when Frank finally arrives at the hospital, neither patient is in any condition to talk. Harold Carlisle has been heavily sedated, his body having gone into shock, and Stephanie Platt is still in the operating room undergoing surgery to save her life. Her leg was so severely injured by the impact that it had to be amputated, and her other internal injuries are massive. She suffered serious blunt force trauma.
Blunt force trauma at moderate to high speed is a very dangerous situation for the patient. The risk of serious injury goes up astronomically. You assume very serious injury in multiple organ systems.
The doctors have been able to run a routine blood test on Harold Carlisle, and the results come back negative for alcohol, another dead end. But as Frank turns to leave the hospital, he is flagged down by Tom Carlisle, Harold's son. Tom tells Frank that he'd been expecting his father that evening for dinner. When he hadn't shown up, he tried calling and eventually drove over to his dad's house. He was surprised to find the Meals on Wheels service breakfast still in the bag and untouched on the kitchen table. Frank asks Tom whether his dad was on any medication or suffered from any medical problems. Tom then reveals a very important fact. His father is an epileptic.
You know, when I think of somebody having a seizure, I think of a little thunderstorm inside the brain. You have all these little electrical impulses like popcorn going off in the brain, but they're all going down the pathway, different pathways all over to get from your brain down to your eyes, to your ears, to your mouth, down to your legs, your arms. And what happens with a seizure is there's an abnormal electrical impulse in the brain, like a spark. And all of a sudden, that spark can trigger other sparks.
Frank learns that Harold Carlisle had been on the same prescription drugs for about 15 years, and as far as Tom knows, has never suffered any side effects.
Tom didn't know the type of medication, but he was able to give me an important clue. He gave me the personal physician, Mr. Carlisle, so that's a person I can follow up with and get a little more detail out of.
Frank gets a call from dispatch reporting that the mechanical inspection revealed no faults or problems with the car, and the only significant damage was sustained in the final collision. While the crash scene evidence has now been exhausted, the medical lead is all Frank has left. His next stop is Harold's personal physician, Dr. Bronson. Dr. Bronson confirms that she met with Mr. Carlisle only a month before to check on his medication. Mr. Carlisle indicated that he hadn't been suffering from any seizures or side effects. She is certain the medication would prevent him from having a seizure, provided he'd been taking the prescribed dosage. That's the next question Frank has to answer.
You have to be very careful if you are self-medicating. And the reason for that is missing a dose of medication may be just as serious as taking too much of the medication. And when you're doing that and you get behind the wheel of a car, then you may put yourself at risk, but more often, you may put others at risk.
Frank recalls a snippet from the conversation he'd had with Tom Carlisle about the Meals on Wheels breakfast sitting untouched on the kitchen table. According to Tom, his father always took his medicine along with his first meal of the day.
The morning of the accident, his father hadn't eaten his breakfast. So there's a possibility that since he didn't eat his breakfast, he didn't take his medicine like he was supposed to.
Frank immediately calls the hospital and speaks to the ER doctor. He asks that the blood test include the level of anti-seizure meds in Harold Carlisle's system.
The blood test results could show something very important. If Mr. Carlisle's level of his medication, his bloodstream was too low or non-existent, he could have had a blackout.
The next morning, Frank returns to the hospital. He's advised that Mr. Carlisle is coming around and is now alert enough to be interviewed.
I asked him what I asked most people involved in accidents. Do you remember anything about the crash?
Can you tell me what happened?
Well, the last thing he remembers was hitting a curb or a bump. Next thing he remembers, he's sitting in his car, someone's knocking on the window, and they're putting a mask on his face, and EMS personnel are there to treat him.
Frank is astonished. Harold Carlisle doesn't remember anything about the crash or the moments leading up to it. That means his car was traveling driverless for a period of time at roughly 80 kilometers an hour. Again, this information fits with the possibility of a seizure, but Frank needs more information.
And I asked him if he remembers the morning, if he had his breakfast. And after saying he didn't remember, he admitted that no, he didn't eat his breakfast. And then I asked him if there's a possibility maybe he didn't take his medication, because he usually takes with his breakfast. And after talking about that for a moment, he finally admitted that no, he didn't take his medication that morning like he was supposed to.
The blood test confirms Mr. Carlisle's admission. The level of anti-seizure meds suggests a period of approximately 12 to 16 hours without medication. Harold Carlisle goes on to admit that he often didn't take his medications as prescribed. Rather, he took them according to his own schedule. This is not the first time that Frank has heard such a confession. He used to be a medic and isn't surprised.
On long-term medication, you're supposed to maintain a therapeutic level of the drug in your system to manage your condition. And if you take your medication on a regular basis, your medication levels go up and down, just like a roller coaster. And that's not a good way to manage your medical condition.
Tragically, Harold Carlisle's failure to adhere to his dosage requirements costs Stephanie Platt her life. Doctors are simply unable to repair damage to her spleen and liver, and Stephanie Platt dies 24 hours after arriving at the hospital.
This is a sad case for the family, certainly of Miss Platt, who was killed in the crash, but also for Mr. Carlisle. He's going through his life managing his condition without knowing that the way he is managing it, by not taking medication properly, could cause a problem like this.
With the final piece of the puzzle in place, Frank can now recreate the tragic events that led to a young woman's untimely death. After failing to take his medication that morning, 68-year-old Harold Carlisle suffers an epileptic seizure and blacks out behind the wheel. His car careens out of control, hops a curb, and slams into pedestrian Stephanie Platt. The violent force of the collision causes massive internal injuries that ultimately claim her life. Frank meets with the state attorney's office to review the case and decide what, if any, charges will be brought against Harold Carlisle.
I met with the state's attorney's office to review the case, and Mr. Carlisle could have been facing motor vehicle manslaughter charges, but because of the circumstance of the case, it was decided not to prosecute him criminally, and Ms. Platt's family decided not to pursue any civil litigation.
Violent collisions kill 3,000 Canadians and injure another 200,000. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story, as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
When it comes to eyewitnesses, we're talking about dealing with human perception. For an accident investigator, that can be tricky. Okay, so you just saw a crash. Can you tell me who might have been braking? Are you absolutely sure? Let's look at it again. Okay, you got to see it a second time. Did you pick up any other details? That's what I was saying about human perception. It can be tricky. Even witnesses with the best of intentions can miss details. That's when it falls to the accident investigator to sort out fact from fiction. But that job becomes more difficult when, for whatever reason, one of the witnesses is trying to hide part of the truth.
It's a warm Saturday afternoon, and 16-year-old Sienna Ashton finally surfaces after spending most of the day in her room with her boyfriend, Mark.
Oh, Sienna, I would like to talk to you.
Sienna's mom, Rhonda, doesn't even have the time to ask where they're going before the teenagers are out the door. Lately, Mark has occupied almost all of Sienna's time, and Rhonda misses spending the occasional weekend with her only daughter. But her stomach turns to ice when she hears the sound of screeching tires outside the house. She flings the door open and is confronted with every mother's worst fear. Her only daughter's body lies motionless on the side of the road. When Sergeant Rod Sadler arrives on the scene, Sienna's body is still there.
When I got there, there were 2 or 3 other people standing around. The mother was very, very distraught, as you can imagine. I mean, I have 2 children myself. I can't imagine what it would be like to hold one of them as they were dying as a result of a car crash.
Sienna has already been pronounced dead by emergency personnel.
The true puzzle was going to be, how did she die? And if someone's at fault in this, how much are they at fault?
Rob's first step is to have a look at the body. Oftentimes, even a quick visual analysis can provide critical clues.
I suspected that there was probably massive broken ribs on her right side, and there was also deep abrasions on her left hip. Injuries on two different sides of the body seemed a little unusual.
But only an autopsy will reveal exactly how Sienna died. Rod photographs the injuries and immediately sends Sienna's body to the medical examiner's office. Then, just as he's ready to begin his inspection of the crash scene, a shouting match between two young men grabs his attention. Mark, Sienna's boyfriend, is arguing with another young man, who has been identified as Robert Stewart.
I looked over and saw two young men basically in a verbal discussion about who was at fault and what had happened.
Those young men are Rod's two only witnesses, and right away he suspects that they won't give him the same story.
It was obvious that they didn't agree on how it happened.
First, Rod pulls Sienna's boyfriend aside to get his version of the story.
We were just walking down the side of the street. We were going down to the corner store. I mean, we know
The 17-year-old tells him that he and Sienna were walking on the side of the road, when all of a sudden, they heard a car coming towards them. Mark maintains that the car was coming so fast, Sienna didn't have time to move out of the way before getting hit from behind. The driver continued on, but seemed to lose control of his car and slammed into a tree just a short distance down the road.
It just seems to, you know, I guess...
Mark describes a classic hit and run, and that leaves Rod wondering. Although he only had a quick look at Sienna's injuries, they are not consistent with a typical pedestrian crash, especially from behind at high speed.
I would have expected to see some broken lower limbs, broken legs. Depending on how tall that person was in relation to the vehicle, there might be some head injury from, for instance, that person wrapping around the front of the car, striking the windshield. In this particular case, there was none of that. There was basically the injury to the right rib cage and the left hip, which was very unusual. It just didn't seem to gel with the stories that were starting to come out.
Maybe they were fighting. Maybe...
The driver has a totally different version of events. Robert Stewart admits that he was driving the car, but he swears that he was not trying to flee the scene because he didn't even know he'd hit Sienna.
Stewart stated that he had stopped, he knew them, he pulled over, they were on the side of the road. He was showing off. He was accelerating away from the scene in an effort to show off to her. Stewart told me that she must have been hanging on to the A-pillar and he accelerated and he didn't realize it, maybe because it's slightly behind the driver's seat. He lost control and drove off the road and hit a tree.
Only when he got out of the vehicle to look at the damage did he realize that he had taken someone along for the ride.
It was possible that that could happen, that someone could actually be dragged and not let go on a car. But I went and looked at the car, and there was no handprints, no evidence of anyone grasping onto the car.
Robert Stewart's story doesn't explain Sienna's injuries either. If she was hanging out of the car and hit the tree, as Stewart claims, her head and shoulders would have shown signs of impact. But Rod didn't notice any injuries above the shoulder at all. Now it's clear that the investigation will rely heavily on the autopsy report. The injuries in this case may very well tell the tale. But Rod has a hunch there's something else the two young men are not telling him. As a next step, he examines the scene for any physical evidence that can help explain what happened. What he finds next could move the case into a completely different and unexpected direction.
As I'm looking around the car, I find a bag of marijuana laying very near to the car. It's obvious it hasn't been there for very long.
Rod knows he's onto something. Dead bodies and drugs are not usually a coincidence.
I confront both Mark and Stuart. I tell them I know they're not being truthful. I know that the drugs are involved somehow in this, and that it's just not adding up with what they're telling me. And they finally both change their stories and begin to tell the same story.
According to both young men, it was Sienna who called Stuart and asked him to come over in hopes of selling him drugs. When Stuart pulled up to the front of her house, Sienna walked over to the car while her boyfriend kept an eye out for passers-by, especially the police. After a brief conversation, Sienna leaned through the driver's window to pass the bag to Stuart. But Stuart was not planning on paying. As soon as he had the drugs in his hand, he stepped on the gas and took off. Then, only a couple of 100 feet down the street, he quickly lost control and slammed into a tree.
Stuart maintained that she was hanging on to the car when he drove away, and that he didn't realize it until after he had hit the tree. If he actually didn't know that she was hanging on to the car, then that would be a valid defense if he were charged criminally with some sort of a homicide. If she was positioned in the car and he knew it, and he maybe intentionally tried, for lack of a better term, wiping her off the side of the car by running up against a tree, then we have maybe a first-degree murder charge.
Mark can't confirm or contradict this version of events. He confesses to taking part in the drug deal, but insists that he did not see the actual crash.
So it becomes really critical to figure out how she's positioned.
Next, Rod takes a fresh look at the scene. There's a skid mark that runs for 148 feet before the vehicle veers off the road and comes within an inch or two of a tree. The tree is slightly deformed, and looking at it closely, Rod sees fabric that looks like denim. Before he goes any further, Rod decides to call the morgue where Sienna's body was transferred. He needs to know exactly what kind of pants she was wearing and whether they match the fabric he found on the tree. Brian Hunter, the medical examiner, answers the phone. Accident investigators and medical examiners often work closely as a team to crack complex crash cases like this one.
And the right ribs? Without his theory, you can't go any further than with just the injuries. You know they're lethal, you know they occurred prior to death, it's reasonable that a car was involved, but you can't go any further. When he puts that in, then I can put my piece in, and it just proves how essential that teamwork is.
Dr. Hunter quickly confirms that Sienna was wearing jeans. In fact, her pants are torn, and they are very dirty. For Rod, this seems to support Robert Stewart's story that Sienna's body was thrown into the side of the tree. But it doesn't explain the strange injury pattern.
At this point in the investigation, I have acceleration marks for a short distance that lead off the road, come very near to a tree, and then I have the car up against another tree. I have a dead 16-year-old girl, and I have an unusual injury pattern on her. I have a suspect and a witness who both now are telling pretty much the same story. The piece of the puzzle that I'm looking for is, was she hanging onto the car, or was she positioned differently?
Accident investigator Rod Sadler is grappling with one of the most unusual cases in his 20-year career. 16-year-old Sienna Ashton is dead after a bizarre car accident that witnesses describe as a drug deal gone bad. The suspect claims that she must have hung on to the side of the car as he tried to make off with a bag of marijuana. But he didn't realize what was going on until his car slammed into a tree further up the road. If investigators can't prove differently, this case could be ruled accidental. But to Detective Sadler, the pieces are still not fitting together.
Okay. I looked at her injury pattern, and things aren't adding up.
Stewart's story still does not explain why Sienna suffered virtually no injuries to her back or head. A likely outcome if she was dragged up against the tree from the outside of the car. It's Rod's job to untangle this mystery.
The piece of the puzzle that I'm looking for that I can't yet find, and that is, how did she die? Where was she in relation to this vehicle? What caused her death? Was she hanging onto the car, or was she positioned differently?
Rod now needs to examine the car. He's pretty sure that the vehicle will give him a clue as to what happened. The car is quite dirty, but there are 2 long rectangular bare spots on the driver's door. Rod remembers the medical examiner, Dr. Hunter, talking about how dirty Sienna's jeans were.
You see these marks here? These are very interesting. Something has brushed against this car very recently. See how the dirt's been disturbed here and it's wiped clean? That is probably an imprint, maybe from Sienna's thighs.
This suggestion that Sienna's legs could have been pressed right up against the driver's side door of the car is a major finding. Rod formulates a provocative theory as to how the accident may have really gone down.
My opinion was that she was partially in the vehicle when he accelerated. She was crushed between the car and the tree.
This scenario would have major implications for the driver, Robert Stewart. If Sienna was actually partway in the vehicle at any time during the accident, it would be nearly impossible for Stewart to claim that he didn't see her.
There was no way that she could have been holding on to the car, and there's no way that Stewart could not have known that her body was in the car when he accelerated. If her thighs are pressed against the driver's door, then there's only one place her torso can be, and that's in the car.
But the prints on the door are not enough. Rod will need concrete medical evidence that shows Sienna was not dragged and thrown, but rather that her hips collided sideways into the tree.
I had to contact the medical examiner. I couldn't wait 2 or 3 months for his report.
He starts to present his findings to support that, and now I start to re-look at the pattern of injury. I've already looked at it once, twice. Now I'm re-looking at it with this new history and trying to decide whether it fits. And it really did fit. So a lot of things made sense. It's sort of a rotational pattern. The abrasion on the left hip made sense for contact with a tree. The abrasion on the side made sense for a scrape along the edge of the window frame. A lot of things made sense. It's sort of a rotational pattern. Scrape against the door frame, scrape against the tree. So that all made sense.
I take his opinion, put it together with mine, and it's like locking 2 pieces of the puzzle together.
With all the pieces in place, Rod Sadler can now replay the chain of events that led to Sienna's death. Sienna Ashton and her boyfriend Mark arrange a meeting with Robert Stewart in the hopes of selling him some marijuana. But as Sienna leans into the car to complete the transaction, Stewart has a change of heart. He grabs the bag and accelerates. Tragically, Sienna remains stuck inside the vehicle, her upper body leaning halfway across the driver's seat and her legs dangling outside the window. Then Stewart's car leaves the road and sideswipes a large tree. Sienna's upper body is immediately sandwiched between car and tree, causing massive internal injuries. She dies almost instantly. The case goes to trial. Sienna's boyfriend is not charged, but Robert Stewart is convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to spend between 2 and 15 years behind bars.
It's really like a scientific experiment. You form your hypothesis, and then you try to prove it. And you anticipate the outcome. And that's what we did.
When you get behind the wheel of a car, you're entering into a contract with society. You're saying you understand the machine can be dangerous and you're going to use it responsibly. Never thought of it that way? Well, remember, a car by itself's never going to hurt anyone. What the driver does or doesn't do will.
It's an ordinary Saturday morning, and Jody Morris is on her way to the mall. She's 7 months pregnant, but neither she nor her husband, Rick, have had time to do much shopping. Today, she'll be looking to load up on clothes and supplies for the new baby. But as she slows down to stop at an intersection, she's startled by a loud noise coming from behind her. Glancing in her rearview mirror, she sees a car bearing down on her at full speed. There's no time to react. and no way that car is going to stop before it hits her. Homicide detective Robert Keenan arrives 45 minutes after the crash. Jody Morris and her unborn child have already been pronounced dead. Jody's crushed body has been stuck between the seat and the steering wheel.
The seconds that it took for this vehicle to be crushed at the speed, Miss Morris never had a chance.
The driver of the other car is on his way to the hospital. He is unconscious, both his legs and one of his wrists are broken, and he has abrasions caused by the airbag deploying.
I looked and I seen the distance that the vehicles had traveled, and right off the top of my head, I knew speed was involved. The other thing that bothered me greatly was when I went back to the point of impact to look, there were no skid marks. None at all.
The absence of any skid marks is a real mystery. There's plenty of other physical evidence, shattered glass, car parts, and other debris, but absolutely no signs of braking.
Certainly when I see no skid marks and I see all this damage, why? Why did this car drive into the back of this other car? There's hundreds of yards of sight distance. You couldn't miss her, she's sitting there.
Robert's first job is to determine exactly how fast the striking vehicle was traveling when it hit Jody's car.
The whole back end was shoved up to the back of the front seat.
Investigators usually analyze skid marks to help calculate speed, but in this instance, he'll need to use a measurement called crush damage.
In Robert's crash, the back end of the car was crushed 54 inches. That's an enormous amount of crush damage. Let me show you what it looks like. We're about right there. So this car would be collapsed from here all the way to right about there. Let's see how close I can come in this wreck. Well, that was only at 35 miles an hour. Imagine if I was going a bunch faster, twice, or even 3 times faster. The crush damage on this car would have been significantly worse. As it is, a lot of crush.
Robert estimates that Powers rear-ended Jody's car at 70 miles per hour. Robert photographs, measures, and documents the site, but he leaves the crash scene with more questions than answers. Now he has the difficult task of telling Rick Morris that his pregnant wife has been killed.
You do prepare yourself, but there's times when you sit back and reflect and you think about the things that you've had to do, especially in this job. It gets to you. You're not human if it doesn't. Everything he had in life, a beautiful wife, a new child, was gone in the blink of an eye. This man drove into the back of that woman and it was gone in a split second.
Detective Keenan next makes his way to the hospital to meet the driver of the other car, Christian Powers. He runs a routine check on Powers' driving record and discovers that the 57-year-old man has been involved in 3 other accidents in the last 2 years. As a result of the last crash, Powers' license had been revoked, but restored shortly afterwards.
When you go in and you see, oh, okay, you had a license revocation. And what are these other accidents about? I had a little bit of information about him that maybe he didn't know that I had.
Christian Powers tells Detective Keenan that he woke up at about 5:30 that morning to get an early start on his weekend vacation. He'd been on the road a lot since his retirement, visiting many of the campgrounds in the eastern U.S. So far, Keenan is sensing nothing out of the ordinary. Powers' blood test comes back negative, so intoxication is also ruled out. Then Powers makes a shocking admission. The last thing he remembers is turning onto a road about 5 miles before the crash site.
5 miles before the accident scene was the last thing he remembered. And all he could think of was, oh my God, how did nobody else die? If he was telling me the truth, that was 5 miles before the accident scene, that was pretty amazing that he didn't hit somebody else.
The lack of brake marks now makes sense. For more than 5 miles, Powers claims to have been unaware that he was even driving. Now, Robert needs to find out why. He asks him if he was on any medication or whether he has any medical conditions. And sure enough, as soon as Robert asks him about the other crashes and why his license had been revoked, Powers immediately refuses to answer any more questions and demands an attorney.
Talk to my attorney.
That threw flags up in the air right away, too. You know, if you're going to talk to me about the accidents, well, why won't you talk to me about why your license was revoked? And he wouldn't. I mean, go see my attorney. That's pretty stiff.
But Christian Powers' silence may be Robert's first lead.
When I left the hospital, I went back and looked exactly what I had. I had a very high-speed accident. I had no brake marks. I had a scenario that this man had blacked out, doesn't know what happened. There was something definitely wrong with him.
Accident investigator Robert Keenan needs to find out why Christian Powers never hit the brakes before rear-ending Jody Morris's car and killing the pregnant woman. The answer could have serious ramifications for both Powers and Jody's family. Detective Keenan's next step is to look into Powers' previous 3 accidents. First, Robert follows up on the most recent one. The police report says that Powers had driven straight into the back of a car waiting at a light. Robert can't believe it. It's an almost identical crash.
He's saying basically the same thing. And it's like, there's something wrong with this guy. There's really something wrong with this guy.
Robert learns that Powers had been admitted to the hospital with minor injuries. His cousin had attended his admittance and informed the doctor that Powers suffered from epilepsy. But when the doctor asked him about it, Powers had denied having any medical conditions.
Positive, I'm not an epileptic.
Epilepsy is a chronic disorder of the nervous system that can result in sudden attacks and seizures. These episodes can be associated with convulsions, loss of consciousness, and abnormal behavior.
What happens with a seizure is there's an abnormal electrical impulse in the brain, like a spark. And all of a sudden, that spark can trigger other sparks. And so instead of going down the normal neurological pathway, like making a phone call from your brain to your arm, so to speak, all of a sudden there'll be multiple phone calls at one time and everything, the whole switchboard's lighting up. And instead of having to reset the computer with Control-Alt-Delete, what happens is people progress. An arm will start to twitch, it'll progress to a leg, it'll go to the other arm, it'll go to the face.
Close to 250,000 Canadians suffer from epilepsy. Every year, more than 15,000 people learn they have epilepsy.
There was a time when epileptics simply could not get a driver license, but times have changed, and many with this affliction can overcome that restriction through proper treatment and have become safe and reliable drivers with the proper safeguards in place. Now, each state has its own regulations, but generally speaking, a 6-month period certified by a doctor that's seizure-free will allow someone with this disease to get a license.
Despite Powers' claim that he was in perfect health, his license was revoked pending a medical review. But then Robert learns that the suspect's license had been restored after another doctor reported that Powers showed no indication of epileptic seizures. Digging deeper into the medical records, Robert discovers a very disturbing fact. Powers has 4 different doctors. This strikes Robert as very suspicious.
He's doctor shopping. He's looking for someone to write him a get-well card so he could get his license back.
Robert learns that Powers has been lying about his condition. According to the medical file, he has in fact been treated for epilepsy by one of the doctors and has a long-term prescribed anti-seizure medication.
So all I can assume is that he wasn't taking his medication and that he had this problem and he was denying it to the medical profession. And that makes him, grossly negligent and reckless in his manner.
After examining all the evidence, the district attorney charges Robert Powers with 1 count of homicide by vehicle, 1 count of manslaughter, and reckless driving. However, the suspect's attorney files a habeas corpus, essentially saying that there was no crime.
The attorney for Mr. Powers stated that because the Department of Transportation had addressed the situation and reinstated his license after revocation, that it was their fault that this accident occurred and not Mr. Powers.
To Robert's disbelief, the judge dismisses the charges.
I was shocked beyond belief. I was mad. I was actually angry.
Robert is determined to see this case through its rightful end. But to refile the charges, Robert needs new evidence. He racks his brain to think of something he might have overlooked.
In my old clues were the medical records and the accident report all talked about the cousin. Well, I hadn't spoken to the cousin. I went back and I told him about Mr. Powers getting off.
Apparently, even as a small child, Powers had suffered grand mal seizures that involved loss of consciousness and falling down. The cousin goes on to say that he'd always suspected that his cousin was not monitoring his condition or treating it responsibly, but he never thought that it might come to this. Robert asks the cousin if he would be willing to testify. He agrees. Then, just as Robert is preparing to circle back with the district attorney, he gets some news that will send his entire investigation into overdrive.
I get a phone call from the District 2 lieutenant, and he says, "Hey, do you know this guy Powers?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." And he says, "Well, he had an accident here in the park." I said, "You're kidding me." He said, "No, I'm not." And he faxed me a copy of the accident report, and here, again, he tells the local officer who took the report that I blacked out, I don't remember what happened.
Robert gathers all the new evidence, the testimonies from the cousin and the new accident report filed just days before the initial charges were dismissed. He is now ready to refile accusations.
Nobody could ignore it this time. And I felt very confident that we would get a conviction.
After a 2-week-long investigation, investigators can finally paint a picture of what happened to Jody Morris on her last day alive. Christian Powers is a diagnosed epileptic, but he's not taking his medication. In the last 2 years, he caused multiple crashes after blacking out behind the wheel. Powers is on the road again when he begins to experience another seizure. In a semi-conscious state, he speeds up to 70 miles per hour. As Jody Morris notices him in her rearview mirror, there is no time to react. He rear-ends her at full speed, killing the 24-year-old pregnant woman instantly. At trial, testimony is given asserting that Powers has misled several police officers about his epilepsy. Evidence also shows that he duped doctors into submitting medical claims reporting that he was seizure-free and fit to drive.
He took the stand during the trial, and he said that he didn't take his medication because it made him feel yucky. It didn't make him feel good.
The judge cannot dismiss the overwhelming evidence and sentences Christian Powers to 3 to 6 years in prison, with 8 years of probation for manslaughter and reckless endangerment.
In my career, I would say it's one of the cases that has made me feel that I've really done something for this community.
Next, the body of a bus driver is found under his own bus, but the strange scenario baffles even the most seasoned of investigators.
Technology's worked to make not only cars, but driving in general a lot safer. Airbags, analog brakes, heads-up display, all of those have made cars and the driving experience safer for everyone concerned. Now, technology also works in the favor of the accident investigator. Some of the data from the car, for example, can be used in accident investigation. Computer programs and all the advancements there make that accident investigator's job that much easier. But this next case will show that all the technology in the world will never replace hard work and good old-fashioned investigative skills.
In late summer of 1995, an office worker shows up at his regular bus stop for the first leg of a long commute home. The bus is already there, but strangely, it's sitting up on the sidewalk and the motor is still running. He looks around for the driver, but there's no sign of him anywhere. And then, as he takes a seat on the curb to wait, he makes a shocking discovery. There's a body pinned beneath the enormous vehicle. When Reconstructionist John Northrup shows up at the scene, the bus is still idling on the sidewalk. It doesn't look like it's been in a crash. Nevertheless, he's got a dead body under extremely mysterious circumstances, and his job is to find out why.
The victim was under the front axle of the bus on one of her sides, but the legs were actually bent up behind the back. I knew it was going to be interesting with the way the bus was and the victim was under the bus. I knew it was going to be a long road.
The body is identified as 42-year-old Brian Bodrick. He's a veteran bus driver, well-liked by both his co-workers and passengers. Even to a trained investigator like John, it's a horrific sight and remarkably unique. Brian has literally been crushed between the pavement and the undercarriage. John is told that the bus was still in gear, the door was open, and that the parking brake was off when the first officer arrived on the scene. Right away, there are two possible scenarios that come to John's mind.
Could have been a mechanical failure where the bus, after the driver got off, just took off on its own, or someone could have made the bus move or actually driven the bus over the top of the victim.
Every vehicle in the fleet has an interlocking braking security system specially made for buses. If the doors are open, the brake automatically comes on, and the bus can't move whether it's in gear or not. The system is in place for the safety of passengers getting on and off the bus.
They could also get off the bus and leave it with just that service brake in neutral, but the parking brake is not on.
Once John's inspection of the body is complete, Brian Bodrick is pulled out from underneath the bus and transported to the local morgue. His next step is to send an officer to a nearby library to see if anyone inside heard or saw anything. Surprisingly, the officer returns just after a few minutes with a young woman named Simone Davies. She was one of the last two passengers on the bus when it pulled into the layover stop.
The young lady who was the second passenger in the bus indicated the gentleman on the bus was upset that he had missed this bus stop, apparently because he was sleeping. And the bus driver was explaining to him that it wasn't a big deal, 10 or 15 minutes at the layover, and he would drive him back the same way.
Suddenly, foul play is looking like a much stronger possibility. John immediately sends out a search team with a description of the man seen arguing with the driver.
The chances were very slim, but we'd probably be able to find him. If this person had had anything to do with it, chances are they were trying to get away, run away, hide.
But as John is about to examine the bus, he gets another incredible break. An officer has located a man in a nearby park fitting the description of the missing witness. Eric Rickles is a 19-year-old unemployed welder who appears to have been drinking. John asks for Rickles to be taken to the police station and held for questioning.
He told us at the beginning, I wasn't even on the bus. We have a witness that said, yes, he was on the bus. Yes, he was talking to the bus driver. Something's going on. He's not being truthful.
With the body removed, John is now able to move about the scene freely. The bus is approximately 100 feet from its usual layover spot and had only come to a stop because it hit a railing. It obviously wasn't going at a high speed, and there are no acceleration or skid marks at all. How Brian ended up underneath his own bus is a complete mystery. Then, while John is making his measurement of the curb, he notices a marking on the sidewalk. There's a chip in the granite smeared with grease or dirt.
This could be important. The chip here could be, it looks fairly fresh. It could have been where a suspension member of the bus or the axle struck as it came up on the curb. It's roughly aligned with the right side of the bus. I'm hoping to find some kind of a mark under the bus to link up.
John Northrup is at a crossroads in his investigation to find out how bus driver Brian Bodrick ended up under his own bus. Minutes before his death, a witness says that he saw Brian arguing with a passenger, Eric Rickles, but Rickles denies it. Other than that, John has a bizarre accident scene with precious little to go on.
We're still back to, was this a mechanical failure of the bus, or was it something where someone intentionally did something and ran the driver over?
The next step is for John to get under the bus. Although the buses are washed regularly, they still collect road grime and grease. Right away, he sees that there's a wiping mark cutting through the grime. It goes from the front bumper back towards the axle where Brian's body was found.
It appears the victim or his clothing actually wiped some road film off the underside of the bumper towards the left side of the bus, which gives me a good idea where the victim came underneath the front end of the bus.
And then he notices a small white mark on the steering axle.
The metal's actually abraded or dented just a little bit with fresh metal underneath, telling me that that's an excellent point where the bus most likely would have struck the curb, making that chip that I saw.
The rest of the forensic mechanical inspection comes back clean. Everything on the bus is in perfect working order, including the brakes and the interlocking systems. John is now forced to conclude that it was somebody, not something, that caused the bus to travel.
It ruled out the accidental or equipment failure aspect. This vehicle, to move from where it was, with the doors open, had to have some sort of human involvement, which meant we needed to speak with Rickles.
John leaves the garage and heads over to the station. Eric Rickles is sober now, and his story changes completely. He admits that he had a fight with the driver because he missed his stop. But after Brian agreed to take him back on the return route, Eric calmly reboarded the bus to wait. And that's when he claims that the bus just started to move. A few seconds later, it just stopped. Rickles swears he was sitting at the back of the bus and had no idea that Brian had been run over. Then he says he just got off. He was already late to meet a friend and figured by now it would be faster to walk.
I slept right through the whole.
I didn't believe Rickles. Rickles is upset with Brian, and he gets back on the bus and he says, fine, I'll show you. I'll close the door. Anyone who rides the buses regular would know the hand lever is what opens and closes the door. And if it was just there with the door open, when he closed the door, the bus would have moved forward.
You passed my stop.
But there's a few things not adding up for John. Why didn't Brian Bodrick simply move out of the way? The bus wouldn't have been going fast at all. And John thinks back at where the bus ended up. He's not sure that a rolling bus would have the energy to mount the curb with enough force to chip the sidewalk.
The next question I had was, would the bus climb up on the curb by itself? And speaking with other people and bus drivers, people at bus company, they actually thought the bus would not, just to release the brake at an idle, go up onto the curb the way that it did.
The ME's autopsy report comes in, but it's not what Detective Northrup expected. It confirms that Brian Bodrick died from something called positional asphyxia.
Well, positional asphyxia is essentially a situation where a person has got himself in a position where his windpipe is shut off, or he's in a position where something is constricting his chest so it can't expand. And the end result is that he suffocates. He can't get air in. And depending on the situation, it can be sudden, like something falls on you, or it can be something where your chest can expand a little bit.
This is a shocking finding. Brian did not die from injuries sustained as a result of the bus hitting or dragging him. On the contrary, Brian was most likely still alive when the bus came to a stop, but his awkward position underneath the vehicle left him unable to breathe. Now there is just one question to answer. Did Rickles actually accelerate into Brian Bodrick? The ramifications could be significant for any criminal case.
When I can't figure something out, I try and go out and do it again without breaking anything big or killing myself.
To prove this one way or the other, John takes the bus back to the crash site to reconstruct the accident.
I took the bus back to the scene originally. I got on the bus and released the parking brake and then closed the door, and the bus rolled forward at an idle. The rubber on the wheels hit the curb, but none of the suspension members, the e-axle or anything, hit the curb to make another chip like I'd seen before. When I accelerated the bus, 3 of the 4 times, the suspension member actually hit the curb and made a chip similar to the one I saw the night of the accident.
This is the final piece of the puzzle for John. It suggests to the investigator that Rickles not only tripped the parking brake, but actually accelerated into Bodrick.
And it makes more sense. The driver would more easily be trapped underneath the bus if the bus was accelerating and he was in front, as opposed to a nice slow idle up to the curb.
After 16 hours of investigation, police now have a working theory as to what happened in the tragic moments that led up to Brian's tragic death. It's the last stop on Brian Bodrick's 7:15 run into town. But one of his passengers, Eric Rickles, is not happy. He missed his stop.
Let's go now. Let's go now. Just bring me back now. Go ahead.
After a brief argument out on the sidewalk, Rickles decides to take matters into his own hands. He closes the doors, tripping the parking brake, and sets the bus in motion. Panicked, Brian runs round to the driver's side window to try and reach in to switch the parking lever. Rickles steps on the gas. Tragically, Brian loses his footing and is dragged under the bus. He survives the impact, but is trapped in such a way that he's unable to take in enough oxygen, and Brian dies of positional asphyxia. Rickles flees as soon as he realized what happened. Eric Rickles was sentenced to 3.5 to 10.5 years in jail for second-degree manslaughter.
John Northrop was able to piece together a puzzling and complicated case. Accident investigator can always go back to the physical evidence. Won't lie, won't let you down. Physical evidence is the backbone of any strong case and is our best guarantee of making sure the right people get punished for their actions.
Every year, violent collisions kill 3,000 Canadians and injure another 200,000. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story, as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
I'm going to bet he's going to land about here. That's my bet.
Here, I'll put your stack of quarters here.
Crashes are like puzzles, and when you've got a crash scene, you've got all the pieces of the puzzle, but you don't know how they go together. It's the accident reconstructionist, the accident analyst's job to put those pieces together. And sometimes you're missing pieces, like, for example, one of the cars involved, as in a hit and run.
It's a beautiful Friday afternoon in a little town. Charlie Newsom is riding along a quiet local road on his way to a nearby restaurant. He's been working there for nearly a year now, and Charlie's never missed a day on the job. Today will be an exception. It's 4 p.m. when accident investigator Weston Brown is called to the scene of a serious hit and run. By the time he arrives, the victim has already been transported to a trauma center. The responding officer informs him that Charlie was unconscious and appeared to be critically injured.
This case seemed, at the time, to be so very disturbing, and as I went on, it became even much more disturbing.
As Detective Brown soon discovers, Charlie Newsom is no stranger to tragedy. At the age of 3, he was in a devastating car accident that killed both his parents and left him with neurological damage and slight autistic tendencies. Adopted and raised by his aunt after the accident, Charlie courageously fought his way through high school and finally received his diploma at age 20. He got his first job the following year, when he was hired as an assistant cook in a restaurant just outside of town.
Charlie had thought of getting a license, but had chosen not to get a driver's license because he didn't feel that he had the faculties to safely operate a motor vehicle, and he didn't want to hurt anyone. And so rather than get a license and drive, which would be the easiest thing to do, he had to ride his bike something like 8 miles each way to work. He chose to do it the hard way.
In a hit-and-run situation, the crash scene is also a crime scene. As a first step, Wes starts collecting as much roadway evidence as possible, but the site isn't offering much information. Then, on the edge of the road, Wes discovers some kind of crack in the asphalt. In one precise spot, it appears to Wes that the crack has been cleaned out, possibly by the bike tire, which would fit inside the crack almost perfectly.
What I think happens is that car strikes the back of that bicycle and it locks up that rear tire. wipes this crack clean. It just takes the dirt and debris out of this crack.
Wes establishes the point of impact to be right there. This tells him that Charlie did not swerve into traffic. The car must have come off the travel portion of the road prior to hitting him.
Always be thinking of what possibilities there are. One of those could be the driver's fallen asleep. Another one could be that the driver's distracted, not paying attention to what's going on, changing the radio, dialing a cell phone. Could this have been an intentional act?
The reason the car left the roadway could have serious ramifications for the driver. But the fact that the person fled the scene automatically makes it a crime. And Wes's immediate priority is to find any clue that will lead him to this individual.
The longer that we go without finding the suspect, the less likely we are to find the suspect or the suspect vehicle.
Okay, for a police accident investigator at the scene of a crash where there's a hit and run, the idea is to get the word out as to what kind of car is missing. So he's going to have to work from evidence at the scene to figure out what kind of car it is, what it might look like, where the damage is. We're going to do an experiment. We're going to see exactly what kind of damage, what kind of evidence on the roadway we can find. That was some crash. All right, assuming we found this car after the hit and run, they tracked him down. The idea is tie this car to this bicycle hit. What we'd be looking for is stuff on the front bumper, some indications here of the tire having been struck. We'll even see print from the tire mark. This is going to help them identify that this car hit a bicycle. We'd be looking through the hood area and then up into the windshield for some indication of a body, in particular the body that was hit in this crash. In here's where his head struck. We're going to find hair, if it's a real person as opposed to the dummy. We may find skin, clothing imprints through here, and bits and pieces off his clothes. We'd look for little teeny threads, and that's going to tie this guy to this hit and run.
Tiny pieces of glass found on the scene tend to confirm what Wes was already expecting. Just like in the typical car-cyclist collision, Charlie's body was thrown up onto the windshield. For the windshield to break, the car needed to be rolling at a minimum speed. But Wes also notes that Charlie and his bike were not found too far from the point of impact. Based on the position of the body and the bike, Wes is then able to estimate the speed of the vehicle.
I did establish the speed range somewhere between 28 and 38 miles an hour.
Having a good idea of the vehicle's speed at the time of impact, Wes is able to theorize on the severity of the car's damage. He puts the word out to dispatch that he's looking for a passenger car with only limited damage to the extreme right front and a smashed windshield. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Charlie's aunt is receiving devastating news. The doctor explains that Charlie's 4th and 6th vertebrae have been crushed, and his spinal cord has been irreparably damaged. The injuries are consistent with Wes Brown's theory of how the crash happened. Charlie's body was thrown onto the car, and his head violently smashed the windshield. His helmet apparently protected him from major head injury, but his neck took the shock. His vertebrae broke on impact, and the resulting damage to the spinal cord cut off most of his nerves from his brain. At age 22, Charlie Newsome will live the rest of his life as a quadriplegic.
Car accidents are a common cause of quadriplegia, and it's oftentimes the most frequent cause that we see in our hospital. Typically, there are injuries to the spinal cord between the 5th and 7th cervical vertebrae, where the spinal cord is either cut or damaged to the point where the nerve signals that are coming from your brain can't go out to your arms and your legs.
After hearing of Charlie's devastating injuries, Detective Brown is more determined than ever to bring this hit-and-run driver to justice.
I learned about Charlie and his disability and the things that he'd been through early on in his life. And I say that because Charlie worked his whole life to be his own man, to be on his own. He just bought his first house on his own with no help from anyone else. And the very thing that he'd worked for all his life, he will never, ever have again, from eating to something as personal as going to the bathroom. Charlie will have to be helped and waited on the rest of his life, which was the very thing that Charlie didn't want.
The victim of a hit-and-run will spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Now, police are counting on investigator Weston Brown's damage profile of the striking vehicle in order to track down a runaway driver. The following morning, Sergeant Dave Morris is on a routine patrol when he notices a red import sedan traveling about 8 kilometers away from the crash site. He only catches a glimpse of the car, but thinks that he observes some damage to the front of the vehicle. He quickly turns around and runs the license plate number through dispatch. As soon as he learns that the car has an expired registration, he pulls the driver over. The driver is identified as Eric McMahon. He tells the police that he's on his way to an auto glass shop to repair his windshield. But when asked about the cause of the damage, McMahon offers an unlikely story. He insists that the car was attacked by a gang of children throwing eggs and rocks. Sergeant Morris takes a closer look at the windshield and notices a few strands of hair in the upper portion.
Sergeant Morrison contacted me and said, I may have a vehicle here. It matches the description that you gave me. The damage is the same, and there's some hair in the windshield. Can you come out and take a look at it?
Eric McMahon is arrested for an expired registration and driving with a suspended license. Wes also obtains a search warrant for the vehicle, and the car is impounded for further investigation. When Wes enters the garage to inspect McMahon's car, he immediately knows he's on the right track. The front bumper is seriously damaged, and Wes discovers marks consistent with a bike tire on the underpinning of the vehicle. The hair from the windshield also matches Charlie's hair color and length. Wes collects the hair samples for DNA testing.
I'm feeling good that I have the right car. This is the car that's involved in the collision. Now I have to do some interviews and in order to put the driver behind the wheel. The question really is, who was driving that vehicle?
Wes interrogates McMahon, who claims that he has no idea what the police are talking about. He has no knowledge of Charlie's accident at all, and goes so far as to say that he was at home all day the day before. Questioned about the hair, he adds a new line to his story, saying that he now thinks he might have also hit a small deer with his car just the week before.
So I'm feeling very confident that this guy's starting to get caught up in his lies.
Looking for more evidence, Wes obtains a search warrant for McMahon's house.
Good evening. Are you Eric McMahon's mom?
Yes, I am.
The suspect is a university student living with his parents. His mother and little sister are obviously distraught when Wes tells them that Eric has been arrested.
I really kind of felt bad for the family, but, you know, a very nice, upper middle class, upstanding mom and dad, still married, good people. They came across at least as very nice people. And here's the police serving a search warrant on their house in this neighborhood.
Wes starts searching McMahon's room for evidence.
One of the things I was looking for was anything that would lead me to the area that Eric was the day before.
And that's exactly what Wes finds. A credit card receipt from a bar situated just a block away from the collision site.
At first, when I looked at it, I just looked in and went, oh, the corner bar, one beer, not that big a deal. And then I looked at the date, and I said, hey, that was the day of the collision. And then I looked at the time, and I went, oh my gosh, that is the time the collision occurred. That is just before the collision occurred. This is really important. And I was very happy to find that piece, because now it leads me down another trail. Now I can go to that bar and contact the people at that bar and talk to them about, hey, do you remember this person? Things like that.
Was he in here
The bartender tells Wes that Eric McMahon is a regular. On the afternoon of the crash, she distinctly remembers him playing some pool by himself, having only one beer, and heading out alone.
And I had to think to myself, well, geez, here's a guy who's even only had one beer. Why is he just hitting this person, leaving his broken body on the side of the road for this man to die?
Weston can now prove that Eric McMahon was in the area of the crash scene at the exact time of the collision. He can also prove that the damage to McMahon's car matches the victim's injuries and the evidence at the scene. And when the DNA test finally reveals that the hair found on the suspect's windshield belongs to Charlie Newsom, Wes is confident that he can recount the events that led to this devastating hit and run.
The facts are the facts.
On a Friday afternoon, Charlie Newsom is riding his bike to work along the cycling lane of a local road. At the same time, Eric McMahon is on his way home after playing pool in a nearby bar.
We're never able to determine why the car left the road. For whatever reason, maybe he was distracted.
For a reason that remains a mystery, McMahon's vehicle leaves the roadway and strikes Charlie Newsome. Thrown onto the hood, Charlie smashes his head on the windshield. The impact breaks Charlie's neck and hurls him up onto an adjacent lawn. Fully aware of what has happened, Eric McMahon contemplates his next move. To stay and help his victim means to accept responsibility for his actions. Instead, he chooses to flee, leaving Charlie's broken body on the roadside.
Probably one of the most touching moments of this entire case for me was the sentencing. Charlie's aunt was there, and she had a prepared letter that she read to the entire courtroom at sentencing. And one of the sentences in there, and I have the letter here with me, one of the sentences in there was, I did, however, read the entire file to Charlie. We haven't got a whole lot else to do these days. And I asked him if there was anything he would like me to say to the court. And Charlie said no. And this, I believe, was because he had already made excuses for Mr. McMahon's behavior and dismissed them from memory. That is what Charlie does to people who injure him. Still, the court may find it interesting, as I did, that as I was putting the file away, Charlie looked up and said, and Your Honor, this is verbatim, "Boy, I'm sure glad I'm not that guy." As he's laying in his bed without the use of his hands, without the use of his arms, without the use of his legs, he says, "Boy, I'm sure glad I'm not that guy." I find that pretty moving.
Charlie Newsome never moved to his new house. He still lives with his aunt. Eric McMahon is presently serving a 7-year prison sentence.
Driving along and suddenly you find a police car parked in your lane across the road. Lights are on. Of course you slow down, but what else are you supposed to do? Emergency vehicles, particularly police cars, don't stop like that for no reason. They're blocking the lane, something's going on. At the very least, you should stop and see if someone comes out to give you directions. When you do go through, you start out at a real low speed and stay that way till you know it's clear, because you never know what's going to be just around the curve.
After a 9-hour flight, Elliot Dobson is on his way home to his family. Fresh out of med school, he spent the last 15 months in Africa as a volunteer medic. Traveling swiftly on a road he knows well, he's just minutes away from a clean bed, familiar faces, and his mom's home cooking. Then, as he winds around a long curve, a woman appears in the middle of the roadway, waving her arms wildly. He sees her just in time to react to the overturned van straddling the lanes in front of him. The woman is hysterical. She explains that she's been in a crash. She's not hurt, but the occupant of the other car has been ejected in the collision. Elliot takes one look at the driver and knows that he's been seriously injured. The man has a wide-open gash on his forehead that is pumping out a lot of blood, and he's complaining of pains in his chest.
Please, there's been an accident over there.
He covers the victim with a blanket to control the man's temperature, applies pressure to his wounds, and reassures him that help is on the way. Matthew Glass is the first police officer to get on the site.
We had to make the scene safe first.
Because the crash occurred just beyond a curve in the road, drivers don't have a lot of time to react to the scene. Officer Glass immediately backs up his cruiser and parks at an angle with the lights flashing to alert approaching traffic.
You want to build a shell around your scene to protect yourselves so you can get in there without worrying about who's coming behind you or who's coming this way, so you can work and do what you've got to do to take care of these people.
Matthew is relieved when he learns that a doctor is already on site. This allows him to relay medical information about the victim to EMS that are already on their way. But Elliot is worried. He knows that traffic crashes are the cause of 55% of paralysis. A few minutes later, veteran accident investigator Mike Barnes is on his way home from work when he notices that the road is blocked ahead of him. By this time, a backup police unit has arrived and an officer is redirecting traffic.
I asked him what was going on. He said he had an accident down the road, and so I decided to go up and see if I could provide some help.
At the scene, Mike immediately recognizes his fellow officer, Matthew Glass. His first question is about the condition of the victims.
He was attending the driver of the van, and Dr. Dobson was attending to him as well. They had stopped the bleeding on his head, and I asked Matt if there was anything else I could do for him.
Matthew asks Mike if he could look after the woman who was also involved in the crash. Betty Reynolds is not injured, but she's still in tears. Her damaged white sedan is parked on the shoulder further down the road. She explains to Mike that she was driving alongside the other car when she dropped her cell phone. She reached down to get it, but before she knew it, a van was skidding out of control in front of her. At some point, the vehicle started to flip over and the driver was thrown out. Once Reynolds regained control of her car, she pulled over and immediately ran to get help.
Anytime you get behind the wheel, there's an alarming number of other drivers around you using their cell phone to send a text message or talk while they're driving. Studies suggest you're 4 times more likely to be involved in an injury crash if you're using your phone and driving. Many states have actually outlawed the use of cell phones, and it's being debated at other states and at the federal level. Should it be outlawed altogether? Still a controversial issue.
As emergency personnel arrive at the scene, an officer approaches to take Betty Reynolds' official statement. Sensing that everything is under control, Mike heads out.
I headed on home. The scene was secured. EMS was on the way, and they did not need me.
But Mike's day is far from over. Just minutes after he leaves the scene, he gets an urgent call from the Traffic Bureau supervisor.
My cell phone rang, and the lieutenant called me and told me about there was an accident at this scene, and I told him that I had just left there. And then he told me he had 2 people dead. Officer Glass was injured. And so then I realized that he was talking about an accident that happened after I had left.
Mike is now asked to handle this case personally. He turns around and rushes back to the site, expecting the worst.
When the lieutenant told me that officers were involved, that heightened my awareness, I think, a little bit more. I had to be honest about that. When we need help, who's going to help us but another cop?
After being thrown from his vehicle in a severe car accident, a man now identified as Bill Witherspoon rests in the middle of the roadway. As EMS personnel arrive on the scene, Officer Matthew Glass and Dr. Elliot Dobson are tending to the victim's injuries. Drivers approaching the curb see police car lights flashing and stop. All except for one.
I began to hear people screaming. Can't see anything because at that time I'm looking at the roof of the minivan. And then I just remember hearing the rev of an engine.
Only minutes before, accident investigator Mike Barnes had left a crash scene that had been completely secured and where everything was under control. He quickly realizes why his boss asked him to return.
Oh, it looked like a bomb had went off compared to what I had seen before.
As Mike gets closer to the vehicles, he realizes that the minivan is back on its wheels. The roof is completely destroyed, and pinned beneath the vehicle is the body of Bill Witherspoon.
That van had rolled and then ended up landing on him, and he died because of that. That impact was real severe.
Debris is now scattered over a 90-meter radius. So Mike knows that whatever hit that van kept running on its own momentum.
I could not find the doctor and could not find Officer Glass. So I continued to walk, and when I went around the van, that's when I spotted Officer Glass over in the side of the road, severely injured.
Matthew Glass has also suffered a tremendous blow to his head, and his leg is crushed and mangled.
I just remember seeing shadows, people running, screaming. None of it was with clarity, though. No, it's like I couldn't see details, but I could see people, bodies.
Several meters down the road, in the center of the roadway, Mike notices another body already covered with a blanket. Dr. Elliot Dobson's trip home has come to a tragic end just a few kilometers from his destination. Having just arrived on the scene in response to the first accident, EMS personnel can no longer help Bill Witherspoon or Elliot Dobson. The priority is now to save the life of Officer Matthew Glass.
I know him, I've known him for some time. So I immediately went to him, and so I helped them load him up into the ambulance. I talked to him, assured him that he's being taken care of, and everything was going to be okay.
Although Mike is a professional who knows he has a job to do, he can't help but be concerned about the well-being of his fellow officer.
Well, it's no doubt police officers are brothers. Typically I would show up, it's a job. But now it's someone that I know, and so it gets a little closer to home. And so it's something that you have to swallow a little bit more, but keep your focus on what the job is, and that is to investigate this accident.
Betty Reynolds tells Mike that as she'd been giving her statement to one of the police officers, a black truck came flying into the curb at an incredible rate of speed. It steered left around the police cruiser and then back onto the roadway, speeding up even more as it entered the crash scene. Neither Betty nor the officer saw what happened next, but both agree the impact was like an explosion. The truck ultimately ended its run slamming into Betty's car on the shoulder of the road. Its driver is identified as Jamie Knight.
When I first approached Jamie, he was already talking to an EMS attendant. He was obviously intoxicated. He smelled of alcohol. His eyes were bloodshot. He had blood on it, some blood on his face, so he was obviously injured, though. But he was very combative, uncooperative. So I asked the officer to secure him and to stay with him as the EMS personnel took him to the hospital. My intentions were for the officer to stay with him so we can get a search warrant for his blood and his urine to find out how much alcohol or drugs he may have had in his system.
As the ambulance transports Knight to the hospital, Mike now sets about documenting and exploring his crash scene. As Mike begins his reconstruction of the second crash, he is struck by one thing. There is no trace at all of Jamie Knight trying to avoid the flipped van.
You know, one would expect to see skid marks. They weren't there.
Witness statements support Mike's findings. Nobody can recall seeing the brake lights on Jamie Knight's truck. Instead, they have him going way above the 90km/h speed limit. Considering the momentum needed to send the van flipping back up onto its wheels, Mike makes his own calculations.
We're talking about speeds up to 70 to 90 miles an hour.
As Mike considers the evidence, Knight's blood test results come back from the lab indicating that Knight's alcohol concentration was more than 3 times the legal limit. After 12 hours of on-scene investigation, Mike is finally ready to reconstruct the events leading to this catastrophic collision. After being ejected from his flipped van, Bill Witherspoon lies sprawled in the middle of the roadway. As EMS personnel arrive on the scene, the victim is already being looked after by Officer Glass and Dr. Dobson. Drivers approaching the curve notice the emergency vehicles ahead and stop, but not Jamie Knight.
Jamie Knight was traveling at a high rate of speed. He went around the police car, and the front end of his car hit the bottom of the van, causing it to rotate violently, spin, and land on top of Bill Witherspoon. And Matthew Glass tells us that he felt a hand shove his back. It had to be Dr. Dobson saving his life.
In a heroic effort, Elliot Dobson tries to push Matthew Glass to safety, but the full force of Jamie Knight's truck barrels into them.
It caught part of me hitting my leg, and unfortunately caught all of, the hood caught all of him.
He gets hit full force with the front bumper of Jamie Knight's vehicle and gets projected down the roadway. Knight's vehicle continues to travel down the road and crashes into the next object that's in his lane, which is Betty Reynolds' vehicle.
Officer Matthew Glass underwent 5 surgeries to save his leg, including bone grafting and metal rod implants. Matthew has now fully recovered from his injuries, but his life will never be the same.
You know, you feel guilty for celebrating your life, for celebrating surviving when the guy standing beside you died. The man at my feet died and the man beside me died, and I survived, so it wasn't my time, I guess.
At the trial, the medical examiner report reveals that Elliot Dobson suffered a serious head injury and died instantly when Knight's vehicle struck him. The report also suggests that Bill Witherspoon would have survived his injuries from the first accident had he not been crushed to death by his own van as a result of the second crash. With a staggering wealth of incriminating evidence against him, a jury finds Jamie Knight guilty on 2 counts of murder, assault in the first degree, and DUI. He is sentenced to 20 years in prison.
You know, as an accident reconstructionist, we can tell you how the accident happened, but to tell you why someone did something is out of our realm. We cannot get into their head. We can only speculate. And as a police officer, I would speculate that Jamie Knight did not want to get caught by the police because he was intoxicated, so he was going to run. But unfortunately, when he came around the police car, there was the van. He had already made up his mind. He was not going to stop.
Well, they're fresh, but they're gonna go away.
Every crash has a story to tell. You heard that in the outset of the show, right? Well, those pages of that story are written out here on the asphalt. Tire marks are like the fingerprints of a given car. But sometimes marks on the roadway can cause more questions than give us answers.
Best part is walk around, all the kids are running.
Ranchers John and Kevin Drake have driven to the regional stock show more times than they can remember. But this year will be different. For the first time in their lives, the 2 brothers will be attending the event without their father, who died of cancer the previous winter.
Remember the time when Dad fell off the horse?
Exchanging fond childhood memories, they tow their stock trailer on what they think will remain a pretty quiet road until they reach their destination. At the same time, Hank Spinner is returning home from work, telling himself the exact same thing. They couldn't be more wrong. When accident investigator Rod Sadler arrives at the crash scene, he learns that he's got 1 dead and 1 seriously injured.
I've learned over the years to separate myself from the personal aspect, not because I'm a person that doesn't care, it's because I have a specific job that I have to do.
On the side of the road, a police officer is looking after Kevin Drake, who has suffered what seems to be a serious head injury during the crash. This is not surprising to Rod, considering the severity of the damage on the Drake's vehicle. But what is surprising is the condition of the unhitched stock trailer. It's only slightly damaged, and the 2 cows still in there appear to be unharmed. Hank Spinner's truck is parked on the other side of the road and has extensive damage to the cab. Although he is severely injured, Kevin Drake is still conscious as officers await the arrival of the paramedics. He keeps asking for his brother. John Drake was not so lucky. Having been seated on the collision side of the vehicle, his body was crushed by the impact of the crash, and he died almost immediately from massive internal injuries.
Well, when I arrive at a scene like that, it's obvious because a death is involved, it's going to affect somebody's family very deeply. And the important thing to me is to help the family through this process because they want to know what happened, why it happened, and how it happened.
By the time the ambulance arrives, Kevin Drake's head has become dangerously swollen. The severity of his head trauma and his state of consciousness indicate that Kevin could have suffered internal cranial bleeding, and the risk of irreversible damage to the brain is very real. If it's the case, time is against him. As the emergency medical technicians lift him inside the ambulance, Kevin manages to tell Rod that he was driving the pickup truck, but has absolutely no recollection of what has just happened. The driver of the other pickup truck is in shock. Hank Spinner only suffered minor injuries, but when Rod asks him about the accident, Spinner does not remember much either. He says he hadn't even realized there was another vehicle coming towards the intersection until he felt a tremendous crash. His own vehicle came to a skidding stop, and only then did he even become aware of the other pickup truck. Rod assesses the scene. He has two paved country roads connecting together in a T intersection with a stop sign in the direction the Drakes were traveling.
Well, it's pretty obvious that he didn't brake until he reached the stop sign, which is far too late to be able to stop. He slides into the intersection. See those offset skids there? That's where impact was. The Drakes had to stop, and it was very clear that they were not able to in time. Was it human error? Is there a mechanical problem?
So do you think a little weight behind a car might make a difference in terms of stopping distance? We're going to find out. What we're going to do is we're going to take this cone, we're going to put it out here on the road. I'm going to drive the trailer toward the cone at a certain speed. Trailer's going to be empty. I'm going to get on the brakes and see how long it takes to stop. Then I'll come back through after we load the trailer. I'll drive the same speed and try to brake from the same point. See if it doesn't take a lot longer to stop, more distance. Let's try that experiment. So that works out to be about 20% longer in this case. Now, here's the deal. If you don't allow for enough space in front of you, when you're towing a heavy load, you could be 20% further into the car ahead of you.
Then, an odd-looking set of skid marks suddenly catch Rod's eye. Just behind the pickup truck set of skids are what reconstructionists call skip skids.
See these skids here? They're almost like a dotted line.
Such intermittent marks are usually made by a trailer bouncing along the road with its brakes locked. It can be the result of bumps, potholes, or other irregularities in the roadway surface.
I don't think that in this particular instance, the trailer bouncing was a factor. And the reason that I came to that conclusion is the beef on board was extremely heavy. So I knew there was I hate to use the word mystery, but there was an element here that really needed to be looked into, because I think that there were more things going on than just maybe a trailer not able to brake completely.
A tragic crash has caused the death of a young rancher and left his brother battling for his life. Accident investigator Rod Sadler is struggling to determine exactly why the pickup truck failed to stop at the intersection. And he's mystified by an uncommon type of skid mark originating about 27 meters behind the point of impact. But the morning after the crash, Rod is faced with what is by far the worst part of his job, interviewing John and Kevin Drake's mother.
In this particular case, it was really difficult because Mrs. Drake had already lost one son. Her other son was suffering critical injuries, possibly fatal injuries. She had so many things going through her mind.
But despite her grief, Mrs. Drake desperately wants an explanation for the crash.
She was willing to speak with me. She answered what questions that she could.
She informs Rod that her sons were on their way to the stock show. They'd set off about 2 p.m. for a 4-hour ride. It was a regular trip for them, so it was a route they both knew well, and they were both accustomed to driving with cattle trailers. This information would seem to cast doubt on the possibility that the brothers may have missed the stop sign or gotten confused at the intersection. The mechanical examination of the pickup truck also shows that the brakes were in perfect condition. This rules out the brake failure scenario. But it's noted that the trailer's electric connector to the truck is old and full of rust. The wires are so frayed that the trailer mechanic suspects that electric signals from the truck would possibly not even be transmitted to the trailer. This would mean that the turn signals, the brake signal, and even the electric brakes on the trailer may not have been triggered when the corresponding devices were activated on the pickup truck.
What caught my eye was there was 2 new wires running along the trailer that looked out of place. They really caught my eye. They looked like they didn't belong there.
Following the suspect wires, Rod notices that they had been connected directly to the trailer's electric brakes.
And if they receive power from another
Based on this observation, Rod develops an amazing theory. In an attempt to bypass the rusted-out trailer plug, could the Drakes have simply failed to properly wire the brakes?
and plug it into an identical plug.
Rod recreates the scenario he has in mind. He connects the trailer's brakes to the pin receiving power from the right turn signal, instead of the one corresponding to the pickup truck's brakes.
Would you spin that wheel for me?
Might such a mistake have caused the trailer's brakes to lock and drag just before reaching the intersection, pulling Kevin's attention away from the stop sign?
Let's see what happens when I turn on the right turn signal. So when I turned on the right turn signal, the brakes locked intermittently. I knew from Mrs. Drake that her sons had to turn to the right to go to the stock show. I figured that this was a very important piece of information in our investigation.
After his accident, Kevin Drake spends 4 days at the hospital under intensive observation. But 48 hours after the crash, he has recovered enough to be interviewed by Rod.
Hi, Mrs. Drake. Hi, Kevin wasn't able to recall much about the crash, but what he could recall was that the day before the crash, they had had some problems with the wiring on the trailer, and that they hardwired the trailer brakes directly into the truck's plug. This really reinforced my theory about the brakes being wired wrong.
This testimony is the final piece of the puzzle, and after nearly a month-long investigation, Rod is able to replay the chain of events that led to Kevin and John's tragic accident. On a Sunday afternoon, Kevin and John Drake set off for their regular 4-hour drive to the stock show. On a road he knows well, about 30 meters before a crossing, Kevin indicates his intention to turn right. But because of a badly wired attachment between the truck and the trailer, every time the right turn signal on the truck flashes, the trailer brakes activate on and off, leaving intermittent marks on the asphalt.
Suddenly there's something dragging on his pickup truck intermittently, and he's focusing on that rather than what's ahead of him. Because of that, he loses his focus, he refocuses, and suddenly he realizes that he's too close to the stop sign. He locks up his brakes. By that time, it's too late.
Kevin Drake completely recovered from his head injury. But like many people involved in a crash, he might never recover a clear memory of the events leading to the accident that cost his brother's life. In this case, no charges were ever brought against Kevin Drake.
Sometimes it's just a little detail that makes the difference between being involved in a fatal crash and getting on with the rest of your life. You drop your phone on the floor, you leave it there. You got a problem with your wiring, you get a professional to fix it. There aren't accidents, they're collisions. Little common sense goes a long way in keeping us all safe on the road.